listening is not reading. That is, listening to a book is not the same thing as reading a book. So if you only listen to audiobooks, then you don't get to say, hey, I read that book. Or at least that's the contention of some people on booktube and book talk. There's a whole debate going on about this and has been going on for a long time now. Now, I'm not truly a booktuber, I guess. I'm booktube adjacent, as my friend Jared Henderson has called himself. I think we're both in that space. We're close. We're maybe out on the periphs. We are maybe in the philosophy tube side of booktube. I don't know. But I have noticed this debate come up. Reading and listening are not the same thing, so you don't get to count books if you've only listened to them. Now, I've kind of changed my mind about this a little bit. Before, I was a super reading snob because I thought of all the virtues of reading, and I thought, hey, listening is a cheap form of gathering that kind of information. You need to do the hard work and sit down and read. But I've recently discovered the joy of listening to a well-done audiobook, and I've changed my mind a little bit. But in this video, I want to cover a recent article from a new friend named Jacob Alli. He writes a Substack called Study the Great Books. It's super good, and he just wrote an article called Listening is Not Reading, and he goes over the distinctions and why reading is a better option for gaining and retrieving information. So I'm going to cover his reasons for thinking that reading is better than listening, and they're not the same thing. And then I'll give my own take on this debate. Now, Jacob Alli is Dr. Jacob Alli. He got a PhD in humanities, and chapter 10 of his dissertation specifically deals with this kind of stuff. And he's recently made chapter 10 available to the public for free, so I'll link that in the description, as well as his original Substack article. So find that there. This video is sponsored by Brilliant, but more on that later. Let's jump right in. So before he jumps in, Dr. Alli gives us 4 concessions to those who prioritize, prefer, or can only listen to audiobooks instead of read written books. The first concession, he says, listening is a meaningful and valuable way to receive information or take in a book. It is meaningful. You don't have to feel bad about that. So he's not trying to demean or devalue listening at all. He also notes that on occasion, listening can be a better option than reading. Concession number 2, auditory reception of information is more natural and more primitive, and it's served us well since the beginning. So for all those who like to point out the fact that for most of human history, people could not read and they got all their information through hearing, you're right. And Jacob acknowledges that point. Concession number 3, Alli is thankful for things like Audible or LibriVox, and he uses them almost daily. And then concession number 4, he's saying that he does not condemn but commends those who aren't able to read, but nonetheless receive books through auditory means. It's commendable to be reading and listening to books. If you can only take in books through your ears, then that's cool. Go ahead and do that. That is a commendable thing. But with those 4 concessions in mind, he goes on to challenge the idea that listening is reading on 2 different fronts. The first front is semantics. He's saying listening just does not mean reading. And then the second front he's going to challenge is value. He thinks that reading is actually more valuable than listening. And so his thesis is this: reading is the superlative form of acquiring and processing information. Now, speaking of acquiring and processing new information, that reminds me of my favorite way to do that, which is Brilliant. Brilliant helps you get smarter every day with thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, data analysis, and even AI. Brilliant is a learning app designed to be uniquely effective. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that helps you play with concepts as you learn. This is a method proven to be 6 times more effective than just watching lecture videos or just reading a book. Brilliant's first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up, and it's a perfect mix of engaging problems, competitive features, and daily encouragement to keep you motivated and on track. Plus, all the content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from Stanford and places like MIT and Caltech, Microsoft, and Google. So while Brilliant helps you acquire and process new information, it also makes you a better thinker at the very same time. They have courses like scientific thinking, linear algebra, programming with Python, thinking in code, exploring data visually, and one of my all-time favorites, how LLMs work. That is how large language models work. So right now, my audience, that's you guys, can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for 30 days for free. Just visit brilliant.org/ParkNotes or click the QR code somewhere on the screen or use the link in my description or pinned comment. And on top of the 30-day free trial, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. All right, so big thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to Jacob Alli's essay. So the first front, which he's challenging the idea that listening is either equal to or the same thing as reading, is semantics. He's saying reading and listening, they mean two different things, and they're two different modes of information acquisition and processing and storing. He says listening is quite literally not reading. They are two different senses and they work in different ways. So he gives an example of talking and writing. Talking is not the same thing as writing. They are different modes of communication. And if you were in the court of law and you said, hey, I've been writing notes to the defendant for years, and the judge says, great, can you produce those notes? And you say, hey, I'm producing notes right now. We're talking. The judge would be rightly confused because talking is a different mode of communication than writing, just as listening is a different mode of information reception than reading is. I think that's a really good point, even if I have muddled it a little bit right here. So I think this semantics point is just straight up correct. Like listening is not the same thing as reading. And it's a little bit confusing when people online say, listening is reading. It's the same thing. It does count if you want to count reading or books read or papers read or whatever the case, whatever you're tracking. If you're saying, I listened to it, or I listened to the audiobook, or I got my device to play it for me or read it for me, then I have read that. That is weird because you haven't read it. You listened to it. And so they're not the same thing semantically. He's right. I don't think that should be very contentious because they're different words, they're different senses, they mean different things, different modes, all that. So that shouldn't be contentious. What may be more contentious is the value point, the value contention that Jacob Alli raises. Now, Alli writes, when communication is well presented and the receiver is fully attentive to it, all things otherwise being equal, reading information is superior to listening to it for the sake of learning. Now, this point may be proven by this very video. I think if you would go and read Jacob Alli's essay, you'd probably remember the contents better than just listening to me talk about it on this YouTube video. Now, maybe that's my fault. Maybe I'm a poor intermediary. Maybe I'm not representing his points super well. Maybe he should have done this or read his essay to you. But I think the point stands. I think that reading does help you remember and store information better than just listening. But I want to talk about that in a little bit. Alli's contention is that reading is more active and it's necessarily active, whereas listening tends to be more of a passive form of information reception. Now, I do want to push back on this point a little bit, and it's going to be a little bit semantic-y and pedantic maybe, but the dude's a humanities PhD, so he'll appreciate that, I think. But let's keep going with some more of his points. He talks about reading's virtues. One of the virtues of reading is actually being able to take marginal notes in the margins of your book. Now, I am 100% on board with this. I mark up all of my books. I have to do that. I don't know if I can show you this, if it's going to show up, but I'm doing a read-along of C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, right now, and it's going really well. I'm doing that over my Substack, Parker's Ponderings. You can come join us. We're like halfway through the book. I'm writing companion essays for this book because it's one of C.S. Lewis's most philosophical and theologically rigorous, and so it's hard to get through, but I love studying that stuff, so I'm writing companion essays to help you get through this book. Could you listen to the audiobook of Miracles and get as much out of it as reading it and taking marginal notes? Maybe if you learn differently like that, but I think reading the book and taking marginal notes is going to be your best bet. And on top of that, I have marginal notes in here from years and years ago, from 5-6 years ago. I can look back at that because I have it already annotated. I can go back to find notes and passages and ideas and concepts and arguments really, really quickly, and I can be refreshed. I can remember, oh yeah, it's in there. That's what he was talking about. So I think marginalia, marginal notes, annotations, I think that alone makes reading more valuable than just listening. Alli also argues that reading is more valuable because you can pause and reflect and think on a particular passage and then go back to it right there, where you can't do that when you're listening to someone, which is not quite true, right? Like Audible, you can pause it and stuff like that, but it's much easier because it's a more active process to stop right there on the page and reread that sentence than to pause and to rewind 30 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever, or to try and raise your hand and get your professor's attention to get them to repeat, if they can, the last sentence that they just said. So when it's actually physically on the page, it's easier to pause and it's easier to allow for reflection. And he also says that reading is better than listening when it comes to comprehension and understanding. Again, all things being equal. Now, I haven't done the research into this kind of stuff myself, but I have done some research reading some journal articles on handwritten notes because I'm a notebook czar. And I've seen that taking notes in your pages, taking marginal notes, and taking notes shorthand, by hand, physically on a paper notebook taps into like spatial awareness type stuff and actually helps you remember where those notes are on the page, which helps you remember that information in the long run. And when you take notes by hand, you're not able to take notes verbatim. You're not able to write as fast as you may be able to type or to record. And so you have to put ideas into your own words, which actually helps you store and metabolize that information and make it your own while you're taking notes in your notebook. So again, I think this all comes down to marginal notes. I think that is the key distinction between listening and reading. I think when you're reading, a physical book is best because of the spatial awareness and because you can take notes and highlight and mark up the text with different symbols that help you remember the book and remember what you've read, but also come back and spark up that memory at a later time because you're not going to master a book after just one reading. Now, Alli's a really good thinker. He's not trying to be a jerk here. So again, if I'm making him out to sound like a jerk, go and read the essay for yourself. But like I said, he's a clear thinker and he addresses some potential objections right there in the essay as well. Like when people quote famous thinkers who say the spoken word is better than the written word. He's like, well, how do we know that that famous thinker, like Socrates, how do we know that Socrates ever said that the auditory word is better than the written word? We only know that he didn't want to write things down because his student, Plato, has written that down for us to read. Now, Alli also makes this really interesting and poignant point that novels and theological treatises and philosophical tomes, they were meant to be read. They were written down and meant to be read, not read aloud and listened to. That's not the mode of communication that they were meant for. And so the teleology of the thing is going to determine the best way to suck information out of that thing. So if you're writing something to be read, the best way to get information out of that is to read it. However, things like musical performances and picture galleries, live theater, sermons, and lectures, these all have a different telos, a different purpose than the written book that's meant to be read. These are meant to be heard. And so it's actually better to go and listen to a play than to just read the play, because that's how it was meant to be heard and the information was meant to be received. So I think that's actually a really fascinating and good point. But like I said in the beginning of this video, chapter 10 of Alli's dissertation speaks to this more. It's on the relationship between storytelling and virtue. So definitely check that out. So here's my own take on Alli's take on the distinction between listening and reading. I think on the semantic issue, he is 100% right. Listening is not reading, and we all know that. They're different words for a reason. They pick out different modes of information reception, and they are different senses. Reading is with your eyes, and listening is with your ears. You can also read with your hands if you're reading Braille, but that still is different than listening, right? And so if someone has different disabilities, there's no shade being thrown at all. Like, do whatever you have to do to receive that information and continue learning. That's awesome and beautiful, and please continue doing that. As for the value issue, I used to be a reading snob, like I said, where I would not think that listening to a book should be done at all. Don't do it. That was really dumb on my part. I started listening to audiobooks of novels, starting with the Sun Eater series by my friend Christopher Rocchio. I started that maybe last year or something. It was awesome. Sometimes the audiobooks are much better. The Star Wars audiobooks are fantastic, but I have a really hard time listening to nonfiction books. I think nonfiction books are just so much easier for me to gather information from if I'm reading them. I can't even listen to them at all. I need to be marking things up, and to me, it's almost a waste of time to not be taking marginal notes in a book while I'm reading it. So if I'm just listening to it, I'm not going to store that information the same way that I need to in order to write a blog post on it or write a philosophical journal article or theology work or whatever the case. When I'm taking in information that's nonfiction, it's usually because I am studying for my philosophy and theology. I'm trying to collect information about a topic that I'm going to write about. And so I have to be taking notes on that. That's different than fiction. I want the fiction story in my head. I want to know what it's about. I want to be able to talk to people about it. I don't get as much information from listening as I would if I read it, but I don't have time to read fiction as much as I want to. And so when I'm driving, I can listen to an audiobook, and that's cool. I don't remember their names. I couldn't spell them because I'm listening and not seeing them, but I'm still getting in that information, and it's enjoyable experience, especially when it's really well done, like a Star Wars audiobook. Now, I do have just one quibble with Jacob Alli's take on listening and reading. I think he downplays listening a little bit too much. I don't know that listening is as passive a thing as he makes out. I think it can tend towards being passive, but then you're not really listening. You're just hearing it, but you're not listening. I think listening is an active thing. If you're gaining information from listening, that style of information gathering is also really tricky. And I learned this the hard way because when I first started listening to audiobooks, I was missing lots and lots and lots from the novels. I had to go back all the time and restart chapters and click the back button and go back 30, 60, 90 seconds because I was constantly missing stuff. I was either splitting my attention doing other things, or I was just not very good at active listening. I was hearing the words, but I was not listening to the words and gaining that information from it. So that's a little quibble, a little semantic point. I think there is a big difference between hearing and listening. I think listening is a necessarily active thing, just as Alli says reading is a necessarily active thing. You can scan a page for the words there, and that's not active. You're not gaining any information. You're just looking at it. And that's the equivalent of hearing, whereas reading is the equivalent of actively listening. So I think these are two different skills. I think you actually have to work on them. If you only read, I think it's going to be hard for you to get information from listening. But I think both skills are very important for us, and I think you should try and master both. If you want to really grasp a book, you should read that book. You should make marginal notes in that book, and then you should listen to the audiobook version of it, and then you should go read that book again. Like if you really want to grab the information out of that, you should do that. Not every book is worth doing that, but a book like C.S. Lewis's Miracles is definitely worth that. You're not going to master a book by reading it one time. You're definitely not going to master a book by listening to it one time. But by mixing those modes, mixing those mediums, by mixing your senses, I think you will get the most out of that book and be able to convey the information to others.